On our anniversary night, my father-in-law kept insulting me, but when I spoke back, my husband slapped me in front of 1,000 guests. Everyone laughed. I wiped my tears and made one call, "Dad, please come." My name is Jocelyn. I am 33 years old and the founder of an elite crisis management firm in Chicago. For years, I hid my true identity to build my own life away from my ruthless billionaire father. I married Trenton thinking he loved me, but I was entirely wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down your old life to show everyone who you truly are. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Country Club was dripping with extravagant wealth and suffocating arrogance. 1,000 guests, dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and caviar. I stood next to Trenton, my husband of 5 years, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that I had paid for with my own money. I never touched the Sinclair family accounts because I had built my public relations firm from nothing. I took immense pride in my financial independence, but to the Sinclair family, I was always the poor girl who had manipulated her way into royalty. Trenton looked handsome in his custom suit, but his eyes were constantly scanning the room for his father's approval. Richard Sinclair, the patriarch of the Sinclair real estate empire, demanded absolute worship from everyone around him. At 62 years old, Richard ruled his family and his corporate empire with an iron fist and a complete lack of empathy. He despised me because I refused to kiss the ground he walked on. He hated that I had my own career and my own mind. The soft classical music faded as Richard stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the room. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound silenced the massive crowd instantly. Richard smiled, presenting a cold and predatory expression that I knew all too well from our private family dinners. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate my son and his wife," Richard announced, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. 5 years ago, Trenton brought Jocelyn home to us. We were all quite surprised by his choice. The Sinclair family has a long and proud history of charitable endeavors. We fund local hospitals, we build community centers, but I must admit tonight that Jocelyn has been my son's biggest charity project to date. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the crowd of wealthy elites. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of humiliation and rising anger. I looked at Trenton, expecting my husband to step forward and defend his wife on our anniversary. Instead, my husband was chuckling along with the guests. Trenton took a sip of his bourbon and looked away from me, cowardly submitting to his father's cruel joke. Richard was not finished speaking. It takes a very generous and patient man to pluck someone from the absolute gutter and give them a seat at the table of Chicago's finest. Richard continued, his eyes locking directly onto mine with malicious intent. "We gave her a last name that commands respect in this city. We gave her a life of luxury she could only dream of while she was struggling in the dirt. Let us raise a glass to Trenton, a man with a heart big enough to adopt a stray." Felicity, my spoiled sister-in-law, laughed loudly from the front row. Her piercing laugh cut through the room like a knife. The entire room raised their expensive glasses to mock me. They expected me to run away crying. They expected the poor girl from nowhere to shrink under the crushing weight of their immense power and wealth. They wanted me to lower my head and accept my place at the bottom of their hierarchy. I did not shrink, and I certainly did not cry. I calmly set my champagne glass down on the nearest table. I walked toward the grand podium with slow and deliberate steps. The crowd parted for me, whispering and pointing as I approached the stage. Richard looked confused as I stepped up beside him. He tried to pull the microphone away, but I grabbed the metal stand from his hand with a grip so tight his knuckles turned white. "Thank you for the lovely toast, Richard," I said. My voice was steady and completely devoid of fear. The entire ballroom fell dead silent. It is entirely true that the Sinclair name commands a certain type of attention in Chicago. But since we are among friends tonight, let us be entirely honest about what keeps that prestigious name out of the federal penitentiary. For the past 3 years, my public relations firm has worked around the clock completely free of charge to clean up the catastrophic and illegal messes this family creates. Richard turned pale and his jaw dropped. He took a step toward me, but I held up my hand and continued speaking clearly to the 1,000 guests. When Richard was investigated for funneling millions of dollars through offshore tax havens last year, it was my firm that buried the story and saved his reputation. When the Sinclair luxury condo project in the South Loop failed basic safety inspections and the roof collapsed, it was my team that silenced the press and paid off the local inspectors so Richard would not go to prison. I have not been your charity project, Richard. I have been your unpaid janitor cleaning up your continuous illegal activities so you can pretend to be an upstanding citizen. The silence in the ballroom was absolutely deafening. The wealthy elite of Chicago stared at Richard with wide eyes and open mouths. Felicity dropped her glass on the floor, shattering it completely. Trenton stormed onto the stage like a wild animal. His face was bright red with blinding rage and ultimate humiliation. "You shut your mouth right now," he yelled, raising his hand. I turned to face my husband without flinching. "Or what, Trenton? Are you going to tell everyone how you embezzled company funds to buy a sports car for your mistress last month?" Trenton lunged forward with a furious scream. He swung his arm and struck me across the face with all his physical strength. The brutal force of the slap sent me crashing to the hardwood floor of the stage. The microphone hit the ground with a loud screeching sound. For a brief second there was pure shock in the room. Then someone in the back of the room laughed. Felicity joined in, pointing at me on the floor. Soon a wave of cruel and mocking laughter washed over the crowd. My husband stood over me, his chest heaving with arrogant pride. "You are nothing without us." Trenton spat down at me. "You are just a piece of trash." I tasted warm copper in my mouth. I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, smoothing my black dress. I did not shed a single tear. I wiped the blood from my split lip, looking directly into Trenton's terrified eyes. I did not say another word to him or his pathetic family. I turned my back on the laughing crowd, walked down the stage steps, and marched straight out the double doors of the grand ballroom. The freezing Chicago wind hit my face as I walked out into the dark parking lot. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the sudden and explosive release of 12 years of suppressed rage. I pulled my phone from my clutch. I scrolled past my regular contacts and manually typed in a phone number I had memorized but never called since I was 21 years old. The line rang only once. A deep and powerful voice answered immediately, as if he had been waiting by the phone for over a decade. "Hello," the voice said. "Dad," I whispered into the cold night air. "Please come." The morning sun brought absolutely no warmth to the freezing city streets as I walked into the lobby of my public relations firm. My jaw throbbed with a dull and persistent ache from the sheer force of the slap I had endured the night before, but my mind was completely clear and focused on survival. I marched past the front reception desk and headed straight into my private corner office. I needed to move capital quickly, secure my extensive client list, and prepare for the inevitable legal retaliation from the Sinclair family. I knew Richard and Trenton would never let my public defiance go unpunished. They were men who built their entire identities on crushing anyone who dared to bruise their fragile egos. I opened my laptop and logged into my personal banking portal to transfer my emergency funds. A bold red banner flashed across the screen. "Account suspended due to suspicious activity." I frowned and quickly navigated to my business banking accounts to check payroll. The exact same red warning stared back at me. "Business account frozen pending legal review." My blood ran cold as I realized the depth of their vindictive planning. Before I could even pick up my desk phone to call the bank manager, my cell phone vibrated loudly on the glass desk. It was a text message from Trenton. The message was short and dripping with his usual narcissistic arrogance. "I told you that you are nothing without me. I locked down every single account you have. You have $0 to your name. Post a public apology video, begging my father for forgiveness and retracting your lies by noon, or you will starve in the streets like the trash you are." I stared at the glowing screen, reading his pathetic and desperate threat. He truly believed he held all of the power in this dynamic. He thought freezing my assets would break my spirit, force me into submission, and make me crawl back to his family on my hands and knees. He had severely underestimated the woman he had been sleeping next to for 5 years. The heavy glass doors of my private office swung open without a single knock. Isaiah strolled into the room wearing a custom-tailored suit and a painfully smug expression on his face. As the lead corporate attorney for the Sinclair family and the husband of my spoiled sister-in-law, Felicity Isaiah was the architect behind all of Richard's dirty legal tactics. He was a brilliant African-American lawyer who had worked 3 times as hard to secure his prestigious position among Chicago's elite. But he used his brilliant legal mind to protect greedy men who would gladly sell him out in a heartbeat. He had always treated me with veiled contempt, viewing me as a weak link in the Sinclair family armor. "Good morning, Jocelyn," Isaiah said cheerfully, as he casually tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto my clean desk. "You really caused quite a spectacular mess at the country club last night. Richard is demanding absolute blood, and Trenton is throwing a massive temper tantrum in the boardroom. I am here to deliver the legal consequences of your little speech." "What is this exactly, Isaiah?" I asked, refusing to look down at the paperwork he had thrown at me. "This is a court-ordered injunction," Isaiah replied, leaning over my desk and resting his manicured hands on the glass surface. "When you and Trenton got married 5 years ago, you insisted on signing a prenuptial agreement to protect this little public relations firm of yours. You wanted to prove your fierce independence to everyone, but you refused to hire outside counsel, assuming the boilerplate contract we provided for you was standard and fair." I kept my face perfectly neutral, letting him talk and reveal his entire strategy. "There was a tiny loophole buried deep in Section 4. Isaiah continued, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "It was a specific clause stipulating that any business entity managed by either spouse could be temporarily absorbed into the Sinclair Holding Trust in the event of a public scandal that threatens the reputation or stock value of Sinclair real estate. Your little microphone stunt last night triggered that exact clause perfectly. You seized my entire company," I stated flatly, analyzing his words. "I certainly did," Isaiah confirmed, tapping the thick document with his index finger. "The judge signed the emergency order an hour ago. You no longer have any legal control of this firm. You cannot access the client list, you cannot authorize any payments, and you cannot enter these premises after today. Trenton instructed me to completely seize your life until you agree to publicly grovel and take back every single word you said about Richard's tax evasion and the collapsing luxury condos." Isaiah walked around the desk and stood right beside my chair. He looked down at me with a mixture of condescending pity and immense superiority. "Listen to me carefully, Jocelyn. Do not try to fight this in court. You do not have the money for a drawn-out legal battle. You do not have the connections to go up against a family like the Sinclairs. They own the judges, they own the local politicians, and they effectively own this city. You are a very smart woman, but you are completely outmatched here. Swallow your immense pride. Make the apology video right now and beg Trenton to take you back. It is the absolute only way you survive this situation." I looked down at the fraudulent injunction resting on my desk. I thought about the grueling years I had spent building this company, the late nights studying public relations, the stressful client meetings, and the desperate struggle to create something of my own, to avoid relying on my father's immense and terrifying wealth. Isaiah genuinely thought he was holding a winning hand. He thought he was advising a helpless and broke victim who had completely run out of options. "Isaiah," I said softly, my voice dangerously calm and collected, "you are a very talented lawyer and a smart man. It is a genuine shame that you tied your promising career to a rapidly sinking ship." Isaiah chuckled loudly, clearly amused by my stubborn defiance. "You are completely delusional, Jocelyn. You have exactly $0 and zero legal leverage. Who exactly do you think is going to step in and save you now?" Before I could even attempt to answer his arrogant question, a low and rhythmic thumping sound echoed in the far distance. The mechanical sound rapidly grew louder and significantly heavier, vibrating through the solid concrete walls of the commercial building. The thick glass windows of my office began to rattle violently in their steel frames. The hot coffee in my ceramic mug trembled and spilled over the edges. The deafening roar of a massive engine swallowed the entire room, making it impossible to hear anything else. Isaiah stumbled back from the window, his smug expression instantly replaced by sheer panic and absolute confusion. The sky outside darkened dramatically as a massive shadow fell over my office windows. I did not flinch or move away. I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt. A black tactical helicopter bearing absolutely no commercial markings descended from the gray Chicago sky and landed heavily on the private helipad located directly on the roof of my building. The heavy steel door, connecting the roof, access to my executive floor, burst open with a violent and ear-splitting crash. 4 enormous men dressed in identical charcoal suits fanned out across the lobby. They moved with terrifying military precision, securing the perimeter in absolute silence. Isaiah froze in his tracks. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face completely melted away. He instinctively took a step back from my glass desk, his hands raising slightly as if preparing to surrender to an unseen firing squad. Then my father walked into the room. William Kensington did not simply enter a space, he conquered it entirely. At 65 years old, he possessed a chilling and predatory aura that made powerful men tremble in boardrooms across Wall Street. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, carrying a silver-handled walking cane that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor with every single step. I had not seen him in 12 long years. I had walked away from his empire when I was 21, because I absolutely refused to become the ruthless, cold-blooded corporate assassin he had trained me to be. I wanted to build something positive with my life. I wanted to create a business based on merit, not destroy competitors for sport. But as I looked down at the fraudulent legal papers attempting to steal my life's work and felt the dark bruise forming on my jaw, I realized that creating was no longer an option. Today, I needed the assassin. My father stopped in the direct center of my office. His piercing gray eyes swept over the shattered coffee mug on the floor, the fake injunction papers scattered across my desk, and finally rested heavily on my swollen lip. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The silence was thick and suffocating. Isaiah swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. His eyes darted nervously between the massive security guards blocking the exit and the billionaire titan standing before him. As a corporate lawyer, Isaiah knew exactly who William Kensington was. Every single attorney in the financial sector knew the name. Kensington Holdings was a financial leviathan that swallowed international conglomerates whole and sold them for scrap parts. Isaiah realized in real time that the woman he had just threatened, the woman his family treated like disposable trash, was the sole heir to an empire that could buy and sell the entire city of Chicago before lunch. "Mr. Kensington," Isaiah stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. His dark skin went pale with sheer terror. "There must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here today. I am the lead counsel for Sinclair Real Estate. We are simply executing a standard legal review of these premises." My father did not even look at Isaiah. He did not acknowledge his pathetic existence. To William Kensington, Isaiah was nothing more than an insect buzzing in the background. My father kept his eyes fixed entirely on me, assessing the damage to my face. "You called Jocelyn," my father said, his deep voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "I came. Who put their hands on you?" I stood up from my chair and walked around the desk. I looked directly at the man I had spent a decade running away from. "Trenton slapped me last night," I said evenly, keeping my emotions locked down tightly. "In front of 1,000 people. And this lawyer standing right here just brought a fake court order to steal my company." My father slowly turned his head to look at Isaiah. The corporate lawyer visibly recoiled, bumping hard into the glass wall of my office. Isaiah was a man who usually commanded total respect in any courtroom, but right now he looked like a terrified child trapped in a cage with a starving lion. "Give me the word," my father said, turning his attention back to me. "Give me the word, and Sinclair Real Estate ceases to exist by noon today. I will freeze their supply chains, initiate hostile takeovers of their subsidiaries, and crush their stock to pennies. I will make sure Trenton and his arrogant father spend the rest of their pathetic lives sleeping in cardboard boxes. I will erase their entire bloodline from the financial registry." His offer was completely genuine. He had the vast resources and the vicious temperament to execute the threat within hours. That was the very reason I had fled his shadow all those years ago. He destroyed lives with the casual flick of a pen. "No," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. Isaiah let out a pathetic, shaky breath, mistakenly thinking I was showing them mercy. He actually tried to force a grateful smile. No, I repeated, stepping closer to my father. Erasing them by noon is entirely too fast. It is too painless. They have spent 5 years humiliating me. They treated me like a stray dog because they believed I had absolutely nothing. They pride themselves on their wealth and their social standing. If you destroy them instantly, they will just feel sorry for themselves. I want to dismantle them piece by piece. I want them to watch their empire burn to the ground, and I want them to know exactly who lit the match. I want them to experience the exact same psychological cruelty they inflicted on me. My father stared at me for a long moment. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. For the first time in my life, I was speaking his language. I was finally acting like a Kensington. As you wish, my father agreed. He signaled to one of his security men. The guard stepped forward and handed my father a thick red dossier. My father placed the heavy folder onto my glass desk, right on top of Isaiah's fraudulent injunction. Your husband and his arrogant father are incredibly foolish men, my father said, tapping the red folder. They just leveraged their entire corporate net worth and all of their personal assets to secure funding for something called the Harbor Project. It is a massive commercial development on the waterfront. They need a continuous flow of capital to keep the construction moving, or they default on the massive loans and face total bankruptcy. I looked down at the red dossier, tracing the edges with my fingertips. And where are they getting all the capital? My father smiled proudly, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. They secured a massive loan through Apex Capital, and I just happen to own the bank that holds their debt. I stared at the thick red dossier resting on my glass desk. The sheer magnitude of my father holding the financial leash to the Sinclair empire was a weapon of absolute destruction. My father tapped his silver cane against the hardwood floor. He instructed his security team to clear out and gave me a curt nod. He promised to stand by while I executed my strategy. I needed them to feel completely invincible before I ripped the ground out from under their feet. I picked up my phone and sent a brief message to Trenton. I kept my tone desperate. I asked him to meet me at a neutral location to discuss my surrender. I chose a high-end cafe in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It was the exact type of pretentious establishment Trenton and his spoiled sister Felicity frequented to feel superior to the working class. I arrived 20 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table. I purposely wore no makeup. I let the dark bruise on my jaw remain visible. I needed to look like a broken woman who had finally realized she possessed no power against Chicago royalty. The bell rang. Trenton walked in, wearing a tailored designer suit. He carried himself with the inflated arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire city. Right behind him walked Felicity. My sister-in-law wore oversized sunglasses indoors and carried a crocodile skin handbag that cost more than my first public relations contract. She scanned the cafe with visible disgust before her eyes landed on my table. They approached like predators cornering a wounded animal. Trenton did not even bother to sit down. He stood towering over my table to maximize his physical intimidation. Felicity dropped into the chair opposite. She pulled down her sunglasses and stared at the bruise her brother had left on my face. She did not show a single ounce of empathy. Instead, she smiled a thin and bloodless smile. You look absolutely terrible, Jocelyn, Felicity remarked smoothly. She signaled a waiter and demanded a sparkling water without making eye contact with the young man. This is exactly what happens when stray dogs bite the hand that feeds them. You should have just stayed in your lane. We gave you a beautiful life and you threw it all away for a cheap microphone stunt. Trenton sneered. Trenton slammed a leather folder onto the marble table. The loud smack made several other patrons turn their heads. He wanted an audience. He craved the attention. My lawyers drew up this paperwork this morning, Trenton stated coldly. You caused a massive headache for my father last night. The board of directors is demanding damage control. I froze your pathetic little business to teach you a lesson about respect. Now you are going to fix the public relations nightmare you created. I looked down at the leather folder. My hands trembled slightly. It was not from fear but supreme confidence. What is this? I asked, keeping my voice small and incredibly fragile. Felicity sighed dramatically. She opened her luxury handbag and pulled out a sleek silver pen. It is your lifeline back to reality, peasant, she snapped. She slid the folder open. Inside rested a non-disclosure agreement and a cashier check. The check was written out for $50,000. My brother is being far too generous with you, Felicity continued, leaning across the marble table. $50,000 is more money than your entire bloodline has ever seen. We know you are completely broke. We know Isaiah won. Isaiah locked you out of your accounts. You take this check. You sign the non-disclosure agreement. You legally swear to never speak a single word about the country club incident or my father's business practices ever again. In exchange, Trenton will call Isaiah and have the injunction lifted. You get your little hobby firm back, and you crawl back to whatever gutter you climbed out of. Trenton crossed his arms over his chest. He looked down at me with ultimate disdain. If you refuse to sign it right now, I will personally ensure you never work in Chicago again. I will bury you in endless litigation until you are sleeping on a park bench. I stared at the $50,000 check. $50,000 was a microscopic fraction of what my firm generated in a single month. It was an insulting and pathetic sum. It highlighted exactly how little they actually knew about my corporate success. They truly believed I was a desperate beggar reliant on their financial scraps. I reached for the silver pen. I let my hand shake visibly. I looked up at Trenton with wide and defeated eyes. If I sign this, you promise peace. You promise to leave my business alone, I asked softly. Trenton smirked. His ego was fully inflated. I promise to forget you even exist, he replied. I lowered my head and pressed the pen to the paper. I signed the document swiftly. I did not sign my legal maiden name. I deliberately signed the paper as Jocelyn Sinclair. It was a calculated legal maneuver. By signing with the Sinclair name, I bound the agreement to my married identity, rendering the extortion attempt completely traceable to their internal marital assets. I slid the signed document back across the shiny marble table. I picked up the check and carefully folded it into my pocket. Felicity snatched the folder greedily. She stood up and adjusted her sunglasses. Enjoy the spare change, she mocked. Trenton did not say goodbye. They turned and walked out of the cafe together. I remained seated at the table. I watched through the window as they climbed into his bright red Porsche and sped away. I pulled out my phone and texted my father's chief financial officer. The bait is taken. Freeze the harbor project funding immediately. We are ready to tear the Sinclair empire entirely down to dust. 2 days later, the waterfront was transformed into a glittering spectacle of unearned pride. The Sinclair family had spared absolutely no expense for the official groundbreaking ceremony of the harbor project. A massive white tent protected the city elite from the freezing wind. Waiters passed expensive champagne. Behind the velvet ropes sat dozens of yellow excavators perfectly positioned for the cameras. This was the crowning achievement of the Sinclair empire. It was actually their beautifully decorated grave. Trenton stepped up to the microphone holding a gold-plated shovel. He flashed his signature arrogant smile for the flashing cameras. He loved pretending to be a visionary builder. The reality was that Trenton had never read a single blueprint. He merely spent his family money and took credit for the labor of others. Today marks a new era for Chicago, Trenton announced loudly. I am building a legacy. Felicity clapped loudly while Richard puffed out his chest with manufactured pride. Trenton raised his hands to signal the construction crew. He commanded the foreman to start the engines for the ceremonial first dig. Instead of the roaring mechanical thunder, Trenton expected absolute silence fell over the construction site. Trenton kept his smile frozen, but his eyes darted around in confusion. He waved his hand aggressively at the chief foreman standing nearby. Start the machines! Trenton yelled away from the microphone. Do it now, the press is waiting. The chief foreman did not start the engine. He crossed his arms and shook his head. He pulled a bright yellow radio from his belt and gave a sharp command. Dozens of construction workers instantly dropped their hard hats and packed up their equipment. Flatbed trucks reversed into the lot to tow the excavators away. Trenton dropped his gold-plated shovel. It hit the concrete with a loud clang. He sprinted off the stage and grabbed the foreman by his vest. What is wrong with you? Trenton screamed. I am paying you millions of dollars. Get back to work before I ruin your pathetic career. The foreman shoved Trenton backward with ease. Trenton stumbled into the dirt, exposing his complete lack of physical presence. "You are not paying us a single dime." The foreman spat back loudly for the press to hear. "Your corporate check bounced this morning. The bank just called my union boss. Your entire account is frozen solid. We are shutting down the site." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. The press surged forward, snapping photos of the humiliating disaster. Felicity covered her face with her handbag, whining loudly about her friends watching. Richard rushed off the stage, his face pale with sudden terror. Isaiah marched toward them, staring down at his glowing tablet. His dark skin was tight with genuine panic. Isaiah was a brilliant lawyer, but right now he watched an avalanche approach. "Tell me this is a banking error," Richard demanded, grabbing his son-in-law. "Call the bank president right now and threaten to sue them." "I cannot call them," Isaiah replied, his voice shaking. "The bank no longer holds our debt, Richard. They sold our $500 million credit line last night." Trenton pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands. He made frantic phone calls, exposing his absolute incompetence. He screamed into the receiver, demanding to speak to the loan officer, but could not remember his name. He did not know the basic terms of his own corporate debt. "Do you know who my father is?" Trenton yelled, pacing in the dirt. "I am a Sinclair. You turn the money back on right now, or I will buy your entire firm and fire you." Trenton hung up the phone and threw it hard against the side of a departing truck. The expensive device exploded into a dozen sharp shards of glass and twisted metal across the dirty pavement. He had no actual business acumen to fall back on. When his family money failed him, he reverted to throwing a childish temper tantrum. He snatched Felicity's phone from her hand and frantically typed a text message to me. My phone buzzed in my pocket from across the city. "You are a curse," Trenton texted me in a blind rage. "You brought your disgusting poverty luck into my family. The second you leave my life, everything goes wrong. I hate you." I read the pathetic message and smiled. He was scrambling for a scapegoat because he refused to look in the mirror. Isaiah was furiously scrolling through the digital loan contracts on his tablet. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he realized the fatal trap they had walked into. He rubbed his sweating forehead, feeling a cold knot forming in his stomach. "We are completely cornered," Isaiah announced, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "The bank sold our debt to a phantom holding company called Apex Capital. I have never even heard of them. There is a covenant buried in the fine print of our loan. If the funding is interrupted for any reason, the entire $500 million balance becomes due immediately." They triggered the freeze to force a default. Richard began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest as the reality of his total financial ruin set in. His entire legacy was evaporating in front of the local news cameras. The Sinclairs had leveraged their personal mansions, their cars, and their remaining corporate assets to secure this project. If they defaulted today, they would lose absolutely everything by tomorrow morning. Suddenly, a sharp chime echoed from Richard's pocket. He pulled out his phone with shaky hands. The screen displayed a highly encrypted email sent directly from the server of Apex Capital. Isaiah leaned over Richard's shoulder to read the glowing text. The message was short and contained no formal greeting. It stripped away all of their Chicago royalty status in two brutal sentences. "The CEO of Apex Capital requires your presence at the penthouse boardroom tonight. Beg for your survival." Richard stared at the glowing screen of his phone, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device into the cold dirt. "Beg for your survival." The words burned into his retinas. He looked up at Trenton, his face completely drained of color. "We have until tonight," Richard whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of sheer terror. "The bank wants us to crawl." Trenton snatched the phone from his father. He read the brutal message, and his entire body shook with indignant rage. He looked at the flashing cameras of the local press gathered outside the chain-link fence. The media had captured every humiliating second of the construction crews walking off the site. Trenton knew the footage would be broadcast across Chicago within the hour. His fragile ego could not handle being portrayed as a massive failure. He needed to control the narrative immediately. "I needed a scapegoat to feed the hungry press, and he chose the exact wrong target. I will fix this," Trenton snapped, straightening his expensive tie. "I am going on television. I will tell the city that my unstable wife emptied our accounts and sabotaged the project. I will make them pity us. By the time we meet this Apex CEO tonight, we will have the public on our side. Across the city, I sat in a high-tech command center my father had secured for me. A wall of flat-screen monitors displayed every major news network broadcasting across the state. I took a slow sip of black coffee and watched as Trenton appeared live on a popular morning broadcast. He wore a dark suit and a perfectly manufactured expression of deep sorrow. The news anchor leaned forward, asking him about the sudden halt at the harbor project. "It breaks my heart to admit this on television," Trenton said, forcing a fake tear to pool in his eye. "My wife recently suffered a severe mental breakdown. She drained our corporate accounts in a fit of paranoid delusion. I spent the last 5 years trying to save her from her impoverished background, but her erratic behavior finally caught up to us. We are the victims of a deeply disturbed woman." I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee cup at the screen. Amateurs react with emotion. Apex predators react with calculated precision. As a crisis management expert, I knew exactly how to dismantle a smear campaign. You never issue a defensive statement. You simply feed the media a juicier piece of meat and watch them tear your enemy apart. I turned to my secure laptop and opened my encrypted communication channels. I had spent years building an untraceable network of media contacts. I selected a prominent investigative journalist at a rival news station who despised the Sinclair family. I attached a massive zip file containing Trenton's private banking statements from the past 72 hours. The documents clearly showed that Trenton had not been robbed by his wife. They showed he spent thousands of dollars on luxury car rentals, expensive diamond jewelry, and lavish hotel suites for his known mistress. I clicked send. Then I opened another channel to an aggressive news outlet. I uploaded the high-definition security footage from the construction site earlier that morning. The video clearly captured Trenton throwing a violent temper tantrum, screaming at the union workers, and shattering his cell phone against a truck. It completely shattered his carefully constructed television image of a grieving, victimized husband. Within 15 minutes, the local media landscape exploded into absolute chaos. The rival networks, furious that Trenton had given an exclusive interview to their competitor, immediately began airing the leaked documents. They splashed his mistress' hotel receipts across their screens. They looped the video of his unhinged construction site meltdown. The narrative shifted with violent speed. Social media completely abandoned the poor husband story and began trending a new hashtag demanding Trenton be investigated for fraud. I watched the live broadcast intently as Trenton continued his pathetic performance. He was blissfully unaware that the rest of the world was currently watching his reputation burn to ashes. He looked directly into the studio camera, placing his hand over his heart. "I just want my wife to get the psychological help she desperately needs," Trenton lied smoothly. "My family operates with total integrity and transparency. We will recover from this temporary setback because the Sinclair name represents honest business." I smiled sharply. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small black flash drive. This drive contained the most dangerous asset my public relations firm had secured. A year ago, I insisted on recording all of Trenton's executive meetings to prepare him for media training. He was so arrogant he forgot the microphones were always recording. I uploaded a specific audio file to the executive producer of the very morning show. Trenton was currently sitting on. I tagged the email as urgent breaking news regarding the active Sinclair investigation. On the television screen, the news anchor suddenly pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece. Her sympathetic expression vanished instantly. She sat up extremely straight and stared at Trenton with cold journalistic intensity. Trenton was mid-sentence complaining about how hard he worked for the city when the anchor abruptly raised her hand to cut him off. "Mr. Sinclair, I must interrupt you," the anchor announced, looking directly into the camera. "We are receiving breaking news right now. Our producers have just verified a leaked audio recording regarding the harbor project. I am being told we have it queued up. We are going to play this live for our viewers right now." Trenton frowned in confusion. His arrogant posture faltered as a sudden wave of panic washed over his face. "What audio recording?" he demanded nervously. The studio went completely silent. Then Trenton's own voice echoed loudly through the television speakers. The recording was crystal clear. It was Trenton laughing arrogantly during a private dinner. "You just hand the city inspectors an envelope with 50,000 cash," Trenton's recorded voice bragged loudly. They looked the other way on the foundation cracks. It is that simple. Chicago runs on bribes and I own the building commission. We saved $2 million by using cheap steel, and those idiots approved it without even walking onto the site. By 6 o'clock, Richard Sinclair organized an emergency charity gala at the Sinclair Grand Hotel. They invited the wealthiest socialites in Chicago. I arrived at the massive Sinclair Grand Hotel at exactly 8 o'clock sharp. For tonight, I deliberately wore a custom emerald green haute couture gown that swept the marble floors with absolute authority. Around my neck rested a flawless diamond necklace from my father's private vault. That single piece of jewelry was worth more than the entire fundraiser. I walked past the bewildered valet and stepped directly into the main ballroom. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the vibrant chatter of the Chicago elite instantly died down. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me. The diamonds around my neck caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. I kept my posture perfectly straight and marched purposefully right toward the center of the room, ignoring the harsh whispers. Felicity Sinclair spotted me first. She abandoned her conversation and marched toward me, her face twisted into a mask of ugly rage. She wore a very tight red dress and carried a frantic, desperate energy. She signaled for two massive security guards to follow her. "What do you think you are doing here?" Felicity hissed, blocking my path. "You are insane if you think you can show your face at our event after the stunt you pulled on television today. Security is going to drag you out by your hair." I looked down at Felicity, my expression entirely bored. I signaled the two security guards with a single sharp look. The guards hesitated, looking at my expensive diamonds and absolute lack of fear. They knew power when they saw it and recognized that Felicity no longer held it. They stepped back, leaving her completely unprotected. "I am simply attending a charity event." "Felicity," I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Your father loves charity projects. He made an entire speech about it at the country club 3 days ago. He said he loved adopting strays and funding the less fortunate." I decided to take his inspiring words to heart. Richard and Trenton pushed their way through the crowd. Trenton looked like a walking corpse. His eyes were bloodshot and his suit was heavily wrinkled. Richard was sweating profusely, his usual commanding presence shattered by the looming threat of total financial ruin. "Get out of my hotel," Richard demanded, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. "You have done enough damage to this family. You ruined my son." "I did not ruin Trenton, Richard," I countered, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously loud. "Trenton ruined himself when he decided to bribe city inspectors and build condos with cheap, unsafe steel." I simply handed the public a magnifying glass. Trenton lunged forward, but Richard grabbed his arm, holding him back. Richard knew they were in a room full of influential investors. He tried to lower his voice to manage the crisis. "Jocelyn," Richard pleaded through gritted teeth, "we are trying to raise money for underprivileged children tonight. If you have a single shred of human decency left in your cold heart, you will leave and let us do some good for this city." I smiled, a sharp and predatory grin that mirrored my father's ruthless business tactics. "Oh, Richard, I am here to be incredibly generous," I announced, projecting my voice so every investor in the room could hear clearly. "I heard the Sinclair family is currently the biggest charity case in Chicago. I heard the Harbor Project lost its funding and your corporate checks are bouncing into the dirt. Therefore, I would like to make a personal donation to your pathetic charity case of a business. I will write you a check for $1 million right now, right here on this stage. All you have to do is get down on your knees and beg me for it." The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths. Investors pulled out their phones, recording the ultimate humiliation of the Sinclair patriarch. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar. I was a man who demanded worship, and I was publicly forcing his face into the mud. "You arrogant, vindictive woman," Felicity screamed, stepping in front of her father. "You do not have $1 million. You are broke. Isaiah froze your accounts. You are wearing rented jewelry and playing a pathetic game of pretend." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a solid gold heavy metal bank card bearing the Kensington Holdings insignia. I held it up for the entire room to see. The financial executives in the crowd immediately recognized the ultra-exclusive card. Murmurs of sheer disbelief rippled through the audience. "Check the name on the account, Felicity," I commanded softly. Before Felicity could squint at the engraved metal, a piercing and chaotic sound shattered the tension in the ballroom. The deafening wail of multiple police sirens echoed from the street outside. Red and blue emergency lights flashed violently against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel. Trenton panicked. He looked frantically at the exit doors. "They are here for her!" Trenton yelled desperately, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She broke the non-disclosure agreement. Arrest her." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. A dozen uniformed police officers and federal agents swarmed into the elegant space. They did not even glance in my direction. The lead detective marched straight past me, his eyes locked entirely on Trenton and Richard. Trenton Sinclair, the lead detective, barked, hand resting on his utility belt. "We have a federal warrant to confiscate every single corporate server, hard drive, and financial document in this building. You are suspected of massive corporate fraud, bribery of city officials, and felony embezzlement. Step away from the crowd and keep your hands where I can see them." I watched him finally realize he was going to prison. The ballroom descended into absolute pandemonium as federal agents swept through the room to seize the Sinclair corporate servers. I did not stay to watch them place Trenton in handcuffs. I turned on my heel and walked out the glass doors into the cool Chicago night. My work at the gala was finished. Miles away in the sterile silence of the Sinclair real estate corporate tower, Isaiah sat alone in his darkened corner office. He had fled the hotel the moment he saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the marble lobby floors. As an attorney, his survival instinct was razor sharp. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck. His hands trembled as he typed frantically on his glowing keyboard. The massive mahogany desk was covered in discarded legal briefs and printed financial statements. Isaiah poured himself a glass of scotch and drank it in one quick swallow. He was a brilliant man. He had grown up in the south side of Chicago and fought through every barrier placed in front of an African-American man trying to break into elite corporate law. He had sacrificed his morals, his sleep, and his soul to climb to the top of the legal food chain. He married Felicity Sinclair to secure his position among the billionaire class. He thought he had outsmarted the system. I thought he had cemented his legacy. Instead, he had chained himself to a family of arrogant, incompetent fools who were currently dragging him straight to a federal prison. His computer screen illuminated his sweating face. Isaiah was desperately trying to unravel the web of shell companies that had just destroyed the harbor project. He needed to find a legal loophole to save his own license. He pulled up the corporate registry for Apex Capital. The firm was buried behind 6 layers of international proxy corporations. Most lawyers would have hit a dead end, but Isaiah knew how wealthy men hid their money. He bypassed the public records and hacked into a specialized offshore database he used for Richard Sinclair's tax evasion schemes. He ran a cross-reference on the bank routing numbers that had purchased the Sinclair debt. The search engine spun for several agonizing minutes. Isaiah wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The screen finally flashed with a match. The holding company was not a faceless entity. It was a subsidiary tied to a singular, terrifying corporate signature. Isaiah leaned closer to the monitor. His breath hitched in his throat. The digital signature belonged to William Kensington. Isaiah felt the blood completely drain from his face. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers and shattered on the expensive carpet. Kensington Holdings was not just a Wall Street firm. It was a global financial predator. William Kensington was known for dismantling entire corporations just because a CEO looked at him wrong. Isaiah frantically opened a new search tab. His fingers flew across the keys as he searched for William Kensington's family history. He bypassed the sanitized public relations articles and dug into archived society pages from 12 years ago. A low-resolution photograph loaded onto his screen. It was an image of a young, fierce-looking woman standing next to the billionaire titan at a charity gala in New York. Isaiah stared at the face of the young woman. He magnified the image. His heart slammed against his ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. The woman in the photograph was Jocelyn, The room started to spin. Isaiah gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. The full horrific reality of his situation crashed down on him. He had not just threatened a struggling public relations consultant. He had not just bullied a poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks. He had forged a fraudulent court injunction to steal a company that legally belonged to the sole heir of the Kensington Empire. Isaiah realized he had handed the federal government the exact weapon they needed to disbar him and lock him in a federal penitentiary for decades. The Sinclairs had treated Jocelyn like a disposable charity case, and Isaiah had enabled their cruelty because he thought she was completely defenseless. He had willingly walked into a lethal trap. His office phone buzzed violently. It was Trenton. Trenton had managed to post an emergency bail after the raid and was demanding Isaiah meet him immediately. Isaiah shoved the printed documents into a thick leather briefcase. He did not bother grabbing his coat. He sprinted out of his office, his mind racing with panicked exit strategies. He needed to abandon the Sinclair family tonight. Isaiah burst into the underground parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Trenton was pacing furiously next to his sports car. His tailored suit was rumpled and his face was red with manic rage. "Where the hell have you been?" Trenton screamed, his voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "The feds just seized every single computer in our building. You need to file a motion to suppress that audio recording immediately. Jocelyn set me up. I want you to draft a lawsuit against her by tomorrow morning. I want her completely ruined." Isaiah did not say a single word. He marched straight up to Trenton and violently hurled the heavy leather briefcase directly into his chest. The metal clasps popped open. The printed documents documenting the Kensington Empire exploded into the air, fluttering down onto the cold concrete floor like a dark snowfall. Trenton stumbled backward, clutching his chest in shock. "What is your problem?" Trenton demanded, looking down at the scattered papers. "We have to destroy her." Isaiah grabbed Trenton by the lapels of his ruined suit and shoved him hard against the side of the expensive sports car. His dark eyes burned with sheer terror and unadulterated hatred. "You arrogant, stupid fool," Isaiah hissed, his voice shaking with absolute dread. "You spent 5 years treating your wife like a pathetic piece of trash. You laughed at her. You slapped her in front of the entire city. You thought she was nothing." Trenton tried to push Isaiah away, but the lawyer held him pinned against the cold metal. "Look at the papers," Trenton, Isaiah commanded, pointing a shaking finger at the documents on the floor. "Look at the name of the man who just bought your entire life." Trenton glanced down at the highlighted name on the nearest page. William Kensington. He looked back up at Isaiah, his face twisting in arrogant confusion. "Who cares about this guy? What does this have to do with my wife?" Isaiah released his grip and took a slow step backward. He looked at the spoiled, incompetent man he had ruined his own life to protect. "You didn't marry a stray Trenton. You married the Reaper, and we are all dead." Trenton stood frozen in the damp parking garage, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of Isaiah's words struck him. Isaiah did not wait for his spoiled brother-in-law to formulate a response. He turned his back on the shattered heir to the Sinclair Empire, walked briskly to his black sedan, and drove away. The tires screeched against the concrete, echoing the intense panic hammering inside his chest. Isaiah knew the Sinclair family operated entirely on transactional loyalty. Richard Sinclair only valued people who could increase his net worth or shield him from federal prison. Felicity, his own wife, viewed their marriage as a convenient accessory to her luxurious lifestyle. If Isaiah went down for the fraudulent injunction he filed against me, the Sinclairs would gleefully throw him under the bus. He refused to become collateral damage for a family of arrogant fools. He parked his car blocks away from his home, pulling a burner phone from his glove compartment. He dialed a direct line to my public relations firm. The call was routed through 3 different secure channels before my voice finally answered the line. I told him I would grant him exactly 5 minutes. I chose the location. It was an upscale, dimly lit jazz lounge in the financial district, an establishment entirely owned by Kensington Holdings. When Isaiah arrived at midnight, the establishment was completely empty except for my private security team standing quietly by the doors. I sat in a velvet corner booth sipping sparkling water. I wore a tailored crimson pantsuit projecting the absolute authority of a woman who held his entire future in the palm of her hand. Isaiah approached the table cautiously. His usual swagger was completely gone. The polished, untouchable corporate lawyer had been replaced by a desperate man fighting for his survival. He did not ask for permission to sit. He slid into the booth opposite me, placing a small silver flash drive on the polished mahogany table between us. "You move fast." "Isaiah," I noted, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "I assume you did not come here to apologize for locking me out of my own company this morning." "Apologies do not carry legal weight," Jocelyn Isaiah replied, his voice strained but steady. "I came here to make a transaction. I know exactly what your father is capable of doing to my career and my freedom." The injunction I filed today was illegal. It was drafted under extreme pressure from Richard and Trenton. If you hand that document over to the state bar and the federal prosecutor, I lose my license and I go to a federal penitentiary. I worked entirely too hard to climb out of the south side of Chicago to let a pampered idiot like Trenton destroy my life. "What makes you think I have any interest in saving you?" I asked, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "You happily enabled their cruelty for years. You watched them treat me like garbage and you smiled while you drafted the paperwork to crush me." "Because I have something you want," Isaiah countered, pushing the silver flash drive a fraction of an inch closer to me. "I know you are dismantling them financially. I know your father bought their debt to trigger a catastrophic default. But financial ruin is not enough for you. You want Trenton to suffer public and permanent humiliation. You want him behind bars." I kept my expression unreadable, waiting for him to play his hand. "Trenton is an incredibly stupid man," Isaiah continued, lowering his voice. "He has been bleeding the Sinclair corporate accounts dry for the past 2 years. He set up a phantom vendor account buried deep in the marketing budget. He used those embezzled corporate funds to pay for luxury apartments, sports cars, and diamond jewelry for a high-end escort he has been seeing since your 2nd year of marriage. He stole millions from his own investors to fund his mistress." A sharp jolt of anger hit my chest, but I quickly buried it under a layer of cold calculation. Trenton had not only abused me emotionally and physically, he had been squandering investor money on a mistress, while demanding I pay for my own basic expenses to prove my financial independence. "Everything is on that drive," Isaiah promised. "The wire transfers the fake invoices, the direct deposits to her offshore accounts. It is a neatly packaged felony embezzlement case. If you hand this to the federal agents currently raiding the Sinclair building, Trenton goes away for 10 to 15 years. I am giving you the exact weapon you need to lock your husband in a cage. In exchange, you grant me full immunity. You do not pursue charges against me for the injunction. You let me walk away from the Sinclair family with my law license intact." I looked at the silver flash drive. It was a tempting offer. It was the silver bullet that would instantly execute Trenton's freedom. But Isaiah was a highly valuable asset, and I was not going to let him escape the battlefield that easily. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the flash drive. "This buys your freedom from the injunction," I stated coldly. "But it does not buy your law license, Isaiah. If you want to keep practicing law in this city, you have to give me the patriarch." Isaiah swallowed hard. His eyes widened in genuine fear. "Richard," he whispered. "Jocelyn. Richard is a completely different animal. Trenton is a sloppy idiot. Richard covers his tracks with blood." "I do not care," I fired back. "Richard is the architect of this corrupt empire. He ordered the tax fraud. He authorized the bribes for the harbor project. You are his lead counsel. You know exactly where all the bodies are buried. I want you to officially flip. I want you to sign an agreement to testify as a star witness for the federal prosecution against Richard Sinclair. You stand up in open court, and you detail every single illegal maneuver he ever forced you to draft." Isaiah stared at me, visibly calculating the immense risk. Testifying against Richard meant making an enemy of a man who routinely destroyed people for minor slights. But looking across the table at me, Isaiah understood that the Kensington Empire was vastly more dangerous. He was caught between a dying wolf and a hungry leviathan. His survival instinct kicked in, overriding any lingering shred of loyalty to his wife's family. "Fine," Isaiah agreed, his voice barely a whisper. "I will testify against Richard. I will give the feds everything they need to bury him right next to Trenton." I slid the flash drive off the table and dropped it into my designer clutch. A smart decision, Isaiah. You can leave now. Isaiah slid out of the booth, but he did not immediately walk away. He leaned over the table, glancing nervously toward the dark windows of the lounge. He looked genuinely terrified. You need to understand something. Jocelyn Isaiah warned, his tone urgently serious. Richard knows he is cornered. He realized the bank pulled the funding, and he knows someone is actively leaking his internal files. He does not play by corporate rules when his back is against the wall. He hired a private security firm this evening. They are essentially highly paid mercenaries who specialize in silencing leaks and eliminating corporate threats off the books. They operate completely outside the law. Watch your back. They will not hesitate to physically remove any obstacle in Richard's way. Isaiah turned and hurried out of the lounge, disappearing into the dark city streets. I sat alone in the booth, absorbing the chilling warning. Richard was escalating to physical violence. He was desperate, bleeding, and ready to kill to protect his fragile legacy. I pulled out my phone and sent a highly encrypted message to my father. The lawyer flipped. I typed quickly. But Richard hired mercenaries. He is hunting the leaks. Prepare the security team. I locked my phone and stood up from the velvet booth. The game of corporate chess was officially over. We were moving into open warfare. I stepped out of the jazz lounge and into the waiting town car. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as we drove toward the most exclusive steakhouse in the downtown district. My father had reserved the entire private dining room on the second floor. When I arrived, William Kensington was already seated at the head of a massive oak table. He swirled a glass of vintage red wine, his sharp eyes evaluating my posture the moment I walked through the door. I took the seat to my designer clutch on the table. The flash drive inside felt heavier than solid gold. We ordered dinner in absolute silence, communicating through shared, calculating glances. We were two apex predators, preparing to devour a dying carcass. The Sinclair family was bleeding out, and they had absolutely no idea how vast the ocean of their destruction truly was. Halfway through our main course, a loud commotion erupted near the entrance of our private dining room. The heavy oak doors burst open. My private security guards immediately stepped forward, reaching inside their tailored jackets. I raised a single hand, signaling them to hold their positions. Trenton stumbled into the room. He looked absolutely pathetic. His custom suit was wrinkled, his tie hung loosely around his collar, and his eyes were bloodshot from panic and lack of sleep. He pushed past the maitre d' and locked his desperate gaze onto me. His eyes darted from my face to the older, incredibly wealthy man sitting beside me. Trenton did not recognize William Kensington. To my arrogant husband, my father was just an anonymous billionaire. Trenton immediately jumped to the most insulting and predictable conclusion. His twisted, narcissistic mind instantly fabricated a story that protected his fragile ego. He genuinely believed I had secured a sugar daddy. I thought the older man funding my expensive dinner was the same man funding my legal retaliation. You move on quickly, Jocelyn Trenton sneered, his voice dripping with condescending disgust. He straightened his ruined jacket and puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his dominance. I guess I finally understand how your little public relations firm stayed afloat all these years. You just find a rich older man to pay your bills the second things get difficult. My father did not react. William Kensington simply sliced a piece of steak, chewed slowly, and watched Trenton dig his own grave. I placed my fork down and looked directly at the man I had married. Trenton, I said coldly, you are currently trespassing in a private dining room. Give me one good reason why my security team should not throw you down the stairs. Trenton suddenly changed his entire demeanor. The aggressive sneer melted away, replaced by a perfectly manufactured mask of deep sorrow. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. He reached out and grabbed the edge of my chair. He looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. It was a spectacular, sickening performance. Jocelyn, please, Trenton begged, letting a single tear roll down his cheek. I am so incredibly sorry. I am losing my mind without you. The slap at the gala, it was not me. You have to believe me. The harbor project has been a nightmare and the stress completely broke my mind. You humiliated my father and I just snapped under the immense pressure. But I forgive you for your speech. I forgive you for freezing our accounts. We can move past this tragedy." I stared down at him. His narcissism was truly boundless. He was actually forgiving me for the abuse he inflicted. "I know you are hurting," Trenton continued, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "I know you are terrified and confused. You do not need to rely on this old man to survive. I am your husband. I love you. Come back home. Drop this ridiculous divorce settlement. Call off your lawyers and I swear we can start completely over. We can build a beautiful life together. Just sign the paperwork withdrawing your financial demands and I will welcome you back with open arms. I will even protect your public relations firm from my father." He was trying to manipulate me. He assumed I was still the weak, desperate woman who craved his validation. He thought a few fake tears and a hollow apology would erase 5 years of systematic emotional abuse. He needed me to drop my legal leverage because he knew his family was facing total bankruptcy. He was begging for his own survival while pretending to be my savior. I looked at my father. William raised one eyebrow, silently challenging me to handle the pathetic creature sobbing on the rug. I turned my attention back to Trenton. I allowed my expression to soften. I let my shoulders drop, faking a posture of total exhaustion and vulnerability. I reached out and gently touched Trenton on the shoulder. He immediately leaned into my hand, believing he had successfully manipulated his broken wife. "You are right, Trenton," I whispered, injecting a heavy dose of fake sympathy into my voice. "This entire situation has escalated way out of control. I am exhausted from fighting. I just want the chaos to end." Trenton smiled in immense relief. His tearful eyes lit up with arrogant triumph. He stood up and brushed the dirt from his expensive trousers. "I knew you would see reason," he said smoothly. "Come home tonight." "I cannot come home tonight," I replied, lowering my gaze to play the role of the submissive wife. "We need to handle the legal mess we created. I will meet you and Richard at the Sinclair corporate office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Bring the post-nuptial agreement. I will sign the settlement, and we can finally put this nightmare behind us." Trenton beamed with overwhelming arrogance. He turned and walked out. The heavy oak doors shut. I smiled at William. It is time for the slaughter. The morning sun glared off the towering glass facade of the Sinclair real estate headquarters. I walked through the revolving doors at exactly 9 o'clock sharp. I wore a tailored ivory suit that projected pristine submission, but underneath the lapel rested a vintage diamond brooch. Embedded within the center diamond was a state-of-the-art micro camera transmitting a live audio and video feed directly to my father's security team. I stepped into the private elevator and rode it to the top floor. My heels clicked against the imported Italian marble of the executive lobby. The receptionist did not even look up to greet me. The sheer disrespect was a company-wide policy mandated by the patriarch himself. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to Richard's sprawling corner office. Trenton sat slumped on a leather sofa, looking like a scolded child who had just been handed a lifeline. Richard stood behind his massive desk. He looked out over the Chicago skyline with his hands clasped behind his back. He radiated the toxic arrogance of old money elitism. He firmly believed his generational wealth made him a god among peasants. He turned around slowly when I entered the room. He did not offer me a seat. He wanted me to stand like a beggar asking for alms. "You are late," Jocelyn Richard snapped, looking at his gold watch. "Time is money, and you have already cost this family entirely too much of both. I expect absolute obedience from you today." I kept my head slightly bowed, playing the role of the broken and defeated wife. "I apologize, Richard," I said softly. "I just want to fix this terrible situation and go home." Trenton stood up from the sofa and puffed out his chest. He was suddenly brave again because his father was in the room to protect him. "I told you she would surrender," Trenton bragged to Richard. "She knows she cannot survive without my credit cards. She is probably starving." Richard silenced his son with a sharp wave of his hand. He picked up a thick legal document from his desk and tossed it violently across the polished wood. It slid to a stop right at the edge of the desk. He pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his pocket and threw it down next to the paper. "This is a post-nuptial agreement," Richard commanded. "My lawyers drafted it at dawn. You triggered a massive public relations disaster at the country club. You embarrassed the Sinclair name in front of the most powerful investors in the state. If you want to remain married to my son and continue living in my properties, you will sign this document right now. I stepped closer to the desk and looked down at the paperwork. What exactly does this agreement entail? I asked, keeping my voice trembling just enough to feed his massive ego. It entails your complete financial surrender, Richard sneered. He walked around the desk and invaded my personal space, trying to physically intimidate me. You will waive all rights to spousal support. You will surrender any claim to the properties you currently reside in. You will legally transfer the full ownership of your pathetic little crisis management firm directly into the Sinclair Holding Trust. You will also agree to a permanent gag order. If you ever speak a negative word about this family again, we will leave you absolutely destitute. Trenton walked up behind me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Just sign the paper, Jocelyn, he whispered in a patronizing tone. It is the only way to save our marriage. You caused all of this unnecessary stress. You made me slap you. Now you have to take responsibility and fix our lives. I looked at the document. The hidden camera in my brooch recorded every single word of their illegal extortion attempt. They were coercing me into signing away my assets under extreme duress. My father's legal team was watching the live feed and documenting the felony in real time. Richard was so blinded by his own arrogance that he never even considered checking me for recording devices. He thought I was just a stupid girl from a poor neighborhood who got lucky when his son proposed. You want me to give up everything? I asked, looking up at Richard with wide, fake tears in my eyes. You have absolutely nothing to give up. Richard laughed cruelly. We gave you your entire life. You were a struggling nobody when Trenton found you. We dressed you. We fed you. We allowed you to pretend you were a successful business owner. Now the playtime is completely over. Sign the document or my security guards will throw you out of this building, and I will make sure you are sleeping in a homeless shelter by midnight. I reached out and picked up the gold fountain pen. My hand was perfectly steady. I leaned over the massive mahogany desk. I did not bother reading the invasive clauses because I already knew the document was legally void the second they threatened me on camera. I flipped to the final page where a blank signature line waited for my submission. Good girl, Trenton mocked, crossing his arms over his chest. Now you finally understand your place in this family. You obey us. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the thick paper. I wrote out my signature with flawless, elegant strokes. I did not rush. I took my time, making sure every single letter was perfectly legible. The ink dried quickly on the page. I placed the gold pen back on the desk with a quiet click. Richard snatched the document from the table with a triumphant and ugly grin. He looked at Trenton and nodded sharply. The trap had been successfully closed in their minds. They had completely neutralized the threat. You can leave my office now, Richard sneered, waving his hand dismissively toward the heavy mahogany doors. Go back to the townhouse and wait for my son to summon you. Do not speak to anyone. Do not contact the media. You are dismissed. I did not move toward the door. I stood my ground. I let the facade of the terrified wife melt away completely. I straightened my posture and raised my chin. The cold, calculating predator inside me finally stepped out of the shadows. I looked directly into Richard's eyes and delivered a smile so incredibly sharp it made the older man physically flinch. You should really read the signature, Richard Boy advised him. My voice was no longer trembling, it was dripping with lethal authority. Richard frowned in sudden confusion. He looked down at the bottom of the post-nuptial agreement. He squinted at the elegant cursive writing. His face instantly drained of all color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replacing itself with raw and unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his desk. Trenton looked at his father in panic. Dad, what is it? Trenton demanded, stepping forward to look at the paper. What did she do? Trenton stared at the signature line. He read the name out loud, his voice cracking in sheer disbelief. Jocelyn Kensington. Richard violently snatched the paper back from his son, his hands shaking so hard the thick parchment tore slightly at the edge. The sheer terror in the room was palpable, a suffocating weight that crushed the remaining air from their lungs. Richard slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk. This is a sick, pathetic trick, Richard snarled, his face contorting into a mask of frantic denial. "You forged the name of a billionaire to scare us. You think I am a fool? Get out of my building right now before I call the police." I did not argue with his delusion. I simply adjusted my jacket, gave them one last look of absolute pity, and walked out the heavy doors. I left them to drown in the rising tide of their own panic. They had less than 12 hours to realize it was not a trick. The freezing wind whipped aggressively off Lake Michigan as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. Later that evening, as the brutal winter chill settled over the busy streets, Richard and Trenton stood silently inside the private high-speed executive elevator of the towering Apex Capitol building. They were no longer the arrogantly confident titans of local real estate who had mocked me relentlessly at the country club. They were sweating, pale, and reeking of profound desperation. Trenton kept adjusting his expensive silk tie, his clammy hands trembling violently against his chest. Richard tightly clutched a heavily worn leather briefcase containing their entire corporate portfolio, the original deeds to their luxury mansions, and the very last pathetic remnants of their dignity. They were here to beg the faceless chief executive officer for a financial lifeline to save the harbor project. If they failed tonight, the ruthless commercial bank would seize absolutely everything they owned by dawn. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. The Apex Capitol penthouse was an absolute masterclass in psychological intimidation. Unlike the gaudy gold-plated excess of the Sinclair headquarters, this floor was stripped down to raw, terrifying power. The imposing physical setting sharply contrasted with their rapidly crumbling financial reality. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, unrestricted view of the city below, making anyone standing inside feel like a god looking down on mortals. Polished black marble floors mirrored their terrified, sweating reflections perfectly. There were no flashy paintings or unnecessary decorations. Every single surface screamed of wealth that did not need to announce itself. This was true predatory wealth, the specific kind of untethered financial power that aggressively swallowed old generational fortunes like the Sinclairs, without breaking a single drop of sweat. Two massive, heavily armed security guards in tailored charcoal suits stepped forward immediately. Their faces were completely devoid of human expression. They silently patted Richard and Trenton down, roughly confiscating their cell phones and watches. Richard tried to protest loudly, citing his prestigious status in the city, but the guards simply stared right through him, as if he did not exist. He was not a king on this floor. He was merely prey being led to the slaughter. The guards pushed open a set of towering frosted glass doors. The main boardroom was cavernous and deliberately, dimly lit. The temperature in the room was intentionally kept freezing, designed to make visiting executives feel physically uncomfortable and severely disadvantaged. A single beam of ambient city light illuminated a massive obsidian table that stretched 20 feet across the room. At the far end of that polished table, sitting entirely in the shadows with her back to them, was a figure resting in a high-backed leather executive chair. Richard cleared his dry throat, desperately trying to summon whatever remaining shred of authority he possessed. He stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly in the silent, intimidating space. "We appreciate you taking this late meeting," Richard began, his voice wavering slightly despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding regarding the funding for our harbor project. The Sinclair family has always been a fundamental pillar of the Chicago real estate community. We bring several decades of proven monumental success. We are here tonight to negotiate new mutually beneficial terms. We are prepared to offer significant financial concessions to ensure this valuable partnership continues moving forward." The freezing room remained completely silent for a long, agonizing moment. The tension in the frozen air was thick enough to slice with a heavy steel knife. The high-backed leather chair slowly swiveled around. I sat in the direct center of the seat, my hands steepled confidently under my chin. I had changed out of the ivory suit from this morning. I now wore a sharp blood-red crimson suit perfectly tailored to project absolute lethal dominance. The ambient light caught the sharp edge of my diamond brooch, the exact same brooch that had secretly recorded their extortion attempt hours earlier. I did not smile. I simply stared at the two men who had spent 5 years making my life a living nightmare. Trenton immediately stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy leather briefcase slipped directly from Richard's hands, hitting the black marble floor with a loud, hollow thud. The documents inside spilled out, mimicking the utter collapse of their empire. The sheer blinding absurdity of their continued psychological denial was utterly staggering. Trenton looked around the empty, cavernous boardroom, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. His mind frantically scrambled to construct a narrative that protected his extremely fragile ego. He stubbornly refused to accept that his submissive, supposedly poor wife was the true architect of his total destruction. He desperately needed to believe I was still completely beneath him. Trenton let out a loud, nervous laugh that echoed awkwardly off the cold glass walls. He pointed a violently shaking, sweaty finger directly at my stoic face. "Who exactly did you sleep with to get in here, Jocelyn?" Trenton's insulting question hung in the freezing air of the penthouse boardroom. He stood there with his chest puffed out, desperately clinging to the pathetic illusion of his own supremacy. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to lower my eyes in shame, just like I had done for the past 5 years, whenever he decided to publicly humiliate me. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked past his trembling shoulder toward the massive frosted glass double doors at the far end of the room. Right on cue, those heavy doors swung open with a violent crash that echoed like a gunshot. The sound made Richard jump out of his skin. Trenton whipped around, his arrogant sneer faltering as a wall of tailored charcoal suits marched into the room. 4 elite security operatives fanned out across the perimeter, sealing the exit completely. Then came the unmistakable sharp click of a silver-handled walking cane striking the black marble floor. William Kensington stepped out from the shadows and into the ambient city light. My father did not just walk into a room. He consumed all the oxygen inside it. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit that radiated predatory authority. At 65 years old, he possessed the terrifying cold-blooded presence of a man who routinely dismantled global corporations before his morning coffee. He glided silently across the length of the obsidian table until he stood directly behind my high-backed leather chair. He placed his hands firmly on my shoulders. It was a clear, undeniable display of absolute ownership and protection. My father looked down at Trenton with eyes that resembled shattered glass. He did not raise his voice, but the immense power behind his words commanded the entire cavernous space. "She did not have to sleep with anyone to sit in this chair," my father stated coldly. "She was born to sit here. I am William Kensington. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Kensington Holdings and the sole owner of Apex Capital. And the woman you just insulted is my only daughter, Jocelyn Kensington." I watched the color completely drain from Richard's face. The Chicago real estate tycoon looked as if he had just been struck by a high-speed freight train. The heavy leather briefcase he had dropped earlier lay forgotten at his feet. Richard knew exactly what the Kensington name meant in the financial world. It meant absolute, unmitigated slaughter. The horrifying reality of his catastrophic mistake crashed down upon him. He had not just bullied a poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks. He had spent half a decade severely abusing the sole heiress to a Wall Street empire that dwarfed his entire existence. He had handed his company's entire debt portfolio directly to the most vicious financial predator in the country. Trenton's brain completely short-circuited. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked frantically from me to my father, his mind violently rejecting the information. "That is impossible," Trenton stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "She was broke when I met her. She had nothing. She worked out of a tiny rented office. We gave her everything." "You gave her an opportunity to study parasitic behavior up close," my father corrected. "She left my empire 12 years ago to build something with her own hands. You mistook her independence for weakness. You mistook her silence for submission. You thought you could treat a Kensington like a stray dog. Now you will learn exactly why she ran away." My father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a vintage gold pocket watch and flicked it open with a sharp snap. The ticking sound filled the frozen boardroom. "As the primary creditor of the harbor project, I am officially calling in the entire balance of your loan," my father announced. Your company has severely violated the morality and public relations clauses embedded in the fine print of our lending agreement. Your violent outburst on television this morning, combined with the catastrophic delay in construction, constitutes an immediate default. You currently owe Apex Capital exactly $500 million. I expect the funds to be transferred into my accounts immediately. You have exactly 60 seconds to clear your debt. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He clutched his chest, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. 500 million. Richard choked out, stepping forward with his hands raised in surrender. William, please. We do not have that kind of liquid capital. All our assets are tied up in the development. Our mansions, our personal accounts. Everything is leveraged. Give us a week. We can restructure. We can sell off subsidiaries. 40 seconds, my father replied, not even glancing up from his gold watch. Trenton began to hyperventilate. The reality of his total poverty finally pierced through his massive ego. He realized he was losing his sports cars, his luxury condos, his designer suits, and his entire identity. He was going to be thrown out into the freezing Chicago streets with absolutely nothing. The immense weight of his spectacular failure crushed his spine. 20 seconds, my father warned, his tone completely devoid of human empathy. Richard dropped to his knees, clutching the edge of the obsidian table to keep from passing out. He was a broken, defeated old man. Time is completely up, my father declared, snapping the gold pocket watch shut. The Sinclair empire is now officially the legal property of Kensington Holdings. Trenton fell hard to his knees on the floor, crawling toward me in sheer pathetic desperation. Tears streamed heavily down his face. "Jocelyn, please," Trenton sobbed hysterically. "I am begging you for mercy." I looked down and slowly slid the torn non-disclosure agreement right across the obsidian table. "You broke the contract when you lied on television," I said coldly. "Time to pay up." I repeated the heavy words slowly, letting the absolute finality of my demand completely sink into Trenton's incredibly thick skull. He just stared at the torn, useless pieces of the non-disclosure agreement resting quietly on the cold obsidian table. He finally realized that his pathetic morning television interview had permanently nullified the only legal shield he currently possessed. I did not give him a single precious second to process his colossal stupidity. I smoothly pulled the small silver flash drive directly from my crimson designer clutch. I held it up high to catch the dim, ambient city light. Richard frantically scrambled up, his breathing hitching loudly. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at the device. "What is that thing?" Richard demanded. "What dangerous game are you playing now?" "I am executing a massive financial foreclosure," I replied. I slotted the metal drive firmly into the boardroom console. I tapped the bright screen. The massive ceiling projector hummed back to life, the back wall illuminated with a blindingly bright display. Classified financial documents and offshore bank routing numbers flooded the screen. Trenton scrambled backward. He recognized the spreadsheets instantly. Blood drained from his terrified face. "Let us review your business acumen, Trenton," I announced, swiping the screen. The display zoomed in on wire transfers. "You embezzled $12 million from Sinclair Real Estate. You buried the stolen funds in a phantom marketing budget. You used investor capital to finance a luxury penthouse for your escort. You bought her diamonds while complaining about my grocery bills." Trenton curled into a pathetic ball on the black marble floor. Richard stared at the projection in horror. "You stole from the company," Richard screamed at his son. "You embezzled from our own investors to fund a mistress. You absolute idiot. You have ruined us." "Do not pretend you possess the moral high ground," Richard Voskert interrupted. I swiped again, revealing heavily encrypted documents. These were the crown jewels of the Sinclair family corruption. I zoomed in on the signature line of a fraudulent tax return. "This is your personal masterpiece, Richard. You manipulated asset valuations to evade federal taxes for 7 years. You authorized the bribes to the city inspectors for the harbor project. I built condominiums with unsafe steel and paid officials to look away." Richard stumbled backward, gripping a leather chair. "How did you get these files?" Richard stammered. "These documents were secured in an offline server. They were heavily encrypted. Only one person had the administrative access to bypass that security." I smiled a lethal and predatory smile. I let the horrific realization slowly wash over his arrogant face. Loyalty in your family is entirely transactional, Richard, I explained smoothly. You treat the people around you like disposable assets. Did you honestly believe your brilliant lead counsel would gladly go down with your sinking ship? Isaiah, Richard whispered. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Yes, I confirmed. Isaiah handed me this drive just a few hours ago. Your African-American brother-in-law worked 3 times as hard as you ever did to earn his legal degree. He spent years covering up your incompetent messes. But the second he realized he was legally cornered by Kensington Holdings, he sold you out to save his own law license. He traded your freedom for his survival. Betrayal always comes from inside the house, Richard. You built a family on greed, and now greed is eating you alive. My father, William Kensington, stepped forward from the shadows. He placed a thick stack of freshly printed legal contracts onto the obsidian table. He slid a black ink pen next to the paperwork. You have 2 extremely simple options tonight. My father stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. Option 1 is total surrender. You will sign these documents right now. You will legally transfer 100% of the Sinclair real estate shares directly to Kensington Holdings. You will sign over the deeds to your corporate headquarters, your private mansions, your luxury vehicles, and every single offshore account you possess. You will walk out of this building with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on your backs. Trenton let out a loud, pathetic sob from the floor. He pounded his fists against the marble tiles. I cannot lose everything, Trenton cried hysterically. Jocelyn, please. I am your husband. You cannot leave me homeless. I ignored his pathetic whining and looked directly at Richard. And option 2, I continued, is federal prison. If you refuse to sign away your entire empire within the next 5 minutes, I will forward the contents of this flash drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are already seizing your servers. Once they see this unencrypted data, you and Trenton will both face a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Sign the papers, Richard, my father commanded. Richard Sinclair stared at the heavy legal contracts. His entire legacy, his arrogant old money pride, and his generational wealth were being stripped away by the very woman he had called a charity case. He looked at me, his eyes bulging with sheer, unfiltered hatred. He opened his mouth to scream a furious insult. He wanted to curse my name. He wanted to fight back. Instead, Richard suddenly gasped for air. His face turned an alarming shade of pale gray. He reached up with a violently trembling hand and tightly clutched the center of his chest. His eyes rolled to the back of his head. He let out a strangled, agonizing wheeze and collapsed completely forward. His body hit the obsidian table hard before crashing heavily onto the polished marble floor. Trenton screamed in absolute terror, scrambling across the floor toward his father's motionless body. Dad, Trenton yelled frantically. Somebody help him. He is having a heart attack. Call an ambulance. I did not pull out my phone. I did not call for help. I calmly reached out, picked up my crystal glass, and took a slow, refreshing sip of ice-cold water. The paramedics swarmed the huge penthouse boardroom within minutes. They quickly hoisted Richard onto a stretcher, strapping an oxygen mask over his excessively sweaty face. Trenton trailed behind, weeping and begging them to save his father. I did not move. My father stood silently by my side, watching the chaotic scene with detached interest. Once the elevator doors closed, taking the shattered remains of the Sinclair leadership away, my father signaled his legal team to gather the documents. We had successfully severed the head of the empire. The very next morning, harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the sterile corridors of the cardiac intensive care unit. Richard had survived the night, but his condition remained highly critical. He was confined to a hospital bed, heavily sedated and entirely powerless. I walked down the VIP wing hallway, flanked by 2 towering members of my father's elite security team. I was not here to offer sympathies. I was here to deliver a very specific message to the golden child who had spent 5 years treating me like garbage. Felicity was pacing furiously outside the unit. She wore an oversized sweater, clutching a coffee cup, looking completely out of her element. The moment she spotted me walking down the corridor, her face contorted into pure hatred. She dropped her coffee. The hot liquid splashed across the polished floor. Felicity let out an unhinged scream and sprinted directly toward me. She raised her manicured hands, intending to claw my eyes out completely, ignoring my heavily protected security detail. My guards reacted with lightning speed. One simply stepped forward, catching Felicity squarely by her shoulders. The physical force stopped her dead in her tracks. She bounced off the guard like a fragile rag doll, stumbling backward, gasping for air. His imposing stance made it perfectly clear that if she took another step, she would be restrained on the floor immediately. "You destroyed my family!" Felicity shrieked hysterically, pointing a shaking finger at me while keeping a safe distance. "You put my father in a hospital bed. You drove my brother insane. You are a vindictive monster. We took you in when you had absolutely nothing. I will make sure you rot in a prison cell." I stepped around the security guard, maintaining a dominant proximity to my terrified sister-in-law. Felicity had spent her entire 31 years functioning as a pampered parasite. She had never worked a single day in her life. She possessed zero practical skills and zero understanding of how the real world actually operated. "You never took me in," I replied, my voice echoing coldly down the quiet hospital corridor. "You used my crisis management firm to cover up your family's continuous illegal activities. You called me a charity case while your father and brother committed felony fraud. Now your illusion of old money superiority is entirely gone forever." Felicity laughed, a bitter sound of pure delusion. "You are totally delusional if you think we are finished," she spat. "My father will recover. Trenton will hire the best defense team in the country. You might have played a trick with the bank, but we still have our personal wealth. You cannot touch us." I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I did not hand it to her. I tossed it onto the cold linoleum floor, right into the spilled coffee. "Pick it up, Felicity," I commanded sharply. She glared at me, refusing to move. My security guard took an intimidating step forward. Felicity flinched, her arrogant defiance crumbling instantly. She slowly bent down and picked up the stained envelope with trembling fingers. She ripped open the seal and pulled out the legal documents. The color completely drained from her face. "That is an official eviction notice," I explained smoothly. "You see, Felicity, you never actually owned that spectacular luxury condominium. The deed was held by a subsidiary of Sinclair Real Estate to shelter taxes. Since Kensington Holdings just legally absorbed 100% of the Sinclair portfolio to cover your brother's debt, I now own your home. You have exactly 2 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property before the police escort you out." Felicity began to shake violently. The papers slipped from her hands. "You cannot do this to me," she sobbed, her tough exterior shattering into a million pathetic pieces. "Where am I supposed to go? I do not have any money in my checking account. I do not have a job. I can, and I just did," I stated flatly. "You should probably start looking into affordable homeless shelters. I hear the downtown ones are quite accommodating during the brutal winter." Felicity's eyes widened in sheer panic. She frantically dug into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. "You are not going to get away with this," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "My husband is the sharpest corporate lawyer in Chicago. Isaiah will file an emergency injunction against you. He will rip you apart in court. I am calling him right now to fix this." She dialed Isaiah's number with frantic, shaking fingers and pressed the phone tightly to her ear. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious reality of her situation crash down upon her. Instead of her husband's reassuring voice, a sterile automated message echoed loudly across the hospital hallway. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Felicity froze. She quickly opened her banking application to check their joint marital accounts. She desperately needed to see her secure financial safety net right now. She tapped the glowing screen, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. The screen loaded, displaying a balance of exactly $0. Isaiah, knowing the Sinclair empire was totally dead, had liquidated their personal assets, drained every single offshore account, and boarded a private flight out of the state before sunrise. He had left his spoiled wife completely penniless to face my wrath entirely alone, proving loyalty is a lie. I turned my back on Felicity as she collapsed onto the cold hospital floor, sobbing over her empty bank accounts. My phone buzzed in my pocket. My executive team was ready. I walked out of the intensive care unit and stepped into the crisp morning air. My black town car waited at the curb. I slid into the leather back seat and opened my encrypted tablet. It was time to deliver the final killing blow to Trenton's public image. I thought he could manipulate the morning news to paint me as an unstable gold digger. He thought the media belonged exclusively to old money elites. I was about to show him how a true crisis management expert controls the global narrative. I dialed my lead media director. Press the button, I commanded smoothly. Launch the total package to every major news syndicate and financial network in the country. Do not leave a single platform untouched. Within exactly 4 minutes, my public relations firm dropped the ultimate digital bomb. We bypassed the local Chicago stations Trenton thought he controlled and went straight to the national broadcasts. The timing was perfectly synchronized with the opening bell of the stock market. I watched the live feed on my tablet as the top morning anchors interrupted their scheduled programming for breaking news. A famous financial journalist looked directly into the camera holding a thick stack of printed papers. "We have just received an unprecedented leak regarding the sudden collapse of Sinclair real estate," the anchor announced gravely. The screen behind him split into two distinct panels. On the right side, the anchor displayed the official Securities and Exchange Commission filings detailing Richard and Trenton's massive corporate fraud, fake safety inspections, and systemic bribery. But it was the footage on the left side of the screen that sent an absolute shockwave across the entire country. I had acquired the high-definition security footage from the country club gala. The video played in a continuous, merciless loop. It clearly showed Trenton standing on the stage, his face twisted in ugly rage, raising his hand and violently slapping me across the face. The audio picked up the cruel laughter of his wealthy friends. The news networks juxtaposed his physical brutality with his financial corruption perfectly. The headlines screamed across the bottom ticker. "Chicago real estate here caught assaulting wife amid massive federal fraud investigation." The narrative was completely out of his hands. Trenton was no longer the grieving victim of a disturbed wife. He was a violent, corrupt coward who hit a woman while stealing millions from hard-working investors. Social media erupted into a fiery hurricane of absolute outrage. Every single person who had laughed at me in that ballroom was now being publicly identified and shamed online by angry mobs. The wealthy elite who had proudly drank Trenton's champagne just 3 days ago were now desperately scrambling to delete him from their lives. The prestigious country club revoked his membership via a public tweet. His fraternity brothers released statements condemning his actions. Even his high-priced mistress, realizing the money had completely dried up, sold an exclusive tell-all interview to a tabloid magazine detailing how Trenton bragged about using cheap steel and residential buildings to buy her expensive diamonds. Trenton became an absolute social pariah overnight. He could not walk down a Chicago street without people spitting in his direction. The public slap had finally been avenged through the exact same media channels he tried to use to destroy me. I sat in my secure penthouse later that evening, watching his empire burn to ash. My father's security team had locked down the entire building. The harbor project was officially dead, the Sinclair mansions were seized, and Richard was lying in a hospital bed under heavy federal guard. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and looked out over the glittering city skyline. I had won. I had systematically dismantled their arrogant dynasty piece by piece. But desperate men do not care about logic when they have absolutely nothing left to lose. The heavy silence of my luxury penthouse was suddenly shattered by a loud, violent crash echoing from the private elevator lobby. The security alarms blared a deafening, high-pitched warning. I placed my wine glass on the marble counter and stood up, my pulse accelerating. My father had stationed armed guards at the ground floor lobby and outside my front door. No one was supposed to be able to breach this floor. I heard the sickening sound of a heavy struggle, a muffled shout, and the dull thud of a body hitting the hardwood floor in the corridor. I moved swiftly toward the kitchen island, pulling open the top drawer to grab the heavy steel chef's knife resting inside. Before my fingers could wrap around the handle, the thick oak double doors of my penthouse living room were violently kicked open. The heavy wood splintered inward, cracking off the hinges. Trenton stood in the doorway. He looked absolutely deranged. His designer suit was torn and covered in dark stains. He reeked of cheap whiskey and sweat. His eyes were completely bloodshot, bulging with a manic, unhinged fury. He had somehow bypassed the ground floor security, likely using an old service elevator code he retained from our marriage. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving, as he stepped over the threshold into my private sanctuary. In his right hand, he tightly gripped the jagged neck of a shattered liquor bottle. The sharp, broken green glass gleamed dangerously under the recessed lighting. Trenton raised the improvised weapon, his hands shaking violently as he locked his crazed, desperate eyes onto mine. "You took absolutely everything from me." Trenton slurred, his voice cracking with homicidal rage as he took a heavy step forward into my living room. "Now I am going to end you." He gripped the broken glass tighter and raised it above his head, ready to plunge the sharp weapon directly into my chest. Trenton took another heavy step forward into my living room, the jagged green glass of the shattered liquor bottle glinting under the recessed ceiling lights. He reeked of cheap whiskey sweat and absolute desperation. The arrogant real estate vice president who had slapped me in front of 1,000 wealthy guests just days ago was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, pathetic man who finally realized he had absolutely no power left in this world. His hand shook violently as he pointed the sharp glass directly at my throat. "You took my entire life away from me!" Trenton screamed, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. "My father is lying in a hospital bed with a federal guard at his door. My sister is living in a cheap motel because her husband stole all her money and fled the country. My bank accounts are frozen solid. I cannot even buy a meal. You stripped away my legacy, my house, and my dignity. You are a monster." I stood perfectly still behind the kitchen island. I did not reach for the steel chef knife resting in the open drawer beside my hip. I simply looked at the pathetic creature standing in my ruined doorway. My pulse remained completely steady. I had spent 5 years living in the suffocating shadow of his volatile temper, carefully navigating his fragile ego to avoid setting off his explosive rage. Tonight I felt absolutely no fear. I looked at the broken glass in his trembling hand and let out a soft, mocking laugh. "I did not ruin your life, Trenton," I replied, my voice echoing coldly across the vast, empty penthouse. "You ruined it all by yourself." I simply turned on the lights and let the rest of the world see the horrific mess you created. You chose to embezzle millions of dollars from your own investors to buy expensive sports cars and diamond necklaces for your mistress. You chose to bribe corrupt city inspectors and build unsafe luxury condominiums with cheap, defective steel. You chose to slap me across the face in front of the entire Chicago elite because you were too weak and insecure to handle a woman telling the truth. Trenton squeezed the neck of the broken bottle so tightly that his own palm began to bleed. Dark red droplets hit the pristine hardwood floor. "Shut up!" he roared, taking another aggressive step toward the kitchen island. "You set me up. You planned this entire thing. You tricked me into signing those legal documents at the office. You purposely humiliated me on national television this morning. You made everyone hate me." "I did not make anyone hate you," I countered, keeping my posture impeccably straight and dominant. "I just stopped covering up your catastrophic failures." For 5 long years, my public relations firm worked exhausting hours to clean up every single illegal mess you and your arrogant father made. I shielded you from federal investigations. I protected your pathetic reputation. But you mistook my professional competence for weakness. You genuinely believed your generational wealth made you completely invincible. You forgot that the money you love so much requires intelligence to maintain, and you possess absolutely none. Trenton let out a furious, animalistic growl. His eyes bulged with homicidal desperation. He was a cornered rat lashing out because he had completely run out of options to save himself. He lunged forward across the room, raising the jagged glass weapon high above his head, aiming directly for my chest. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cower in terror. He thought his physical aggression would finally force me back into submission. He never even made it halfway to the kitchen island. From the dark shadows of the adjoining hallway, 3 massive security operatives materialized with terrifying speed and precision. My father did not just hire bodyguards. William Kensington employed elite tactical specialists who moved in total silence. Before Trenton could even swing his arm down, the lead operative stepped into his path and grabbed his wrist with bone-crushing force. Trenton let out a sharp yelp of pain as the operative twisted his arm violently backward, forcing him to drop the shattered liquor bottle. The green glass clattered uselessly across the marble floor. The other two operatives tackled Trenton simultaneously. They slammed him face first into the solid hardwood floor with a deafening thud. The sheer impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. One operative firmly planted a heavy tactical boot squarely between Trenton's shoulder blades, pinning him completely flat against the ground. The lead operative swiftly secured Trenton's arms behind his back, with industrial zip ties pulling them agonizingly tight. Trenton gasped for air, his face pressed painfully against the cold floor, his nose bleeding from the violent impact. I walked slowly around the kitchen island and stood over him. I looked down at the man who used to terrorize me. "I told you that you were trespassing," I stated calmly. "You really should learn to listen when people give you fair warnings." Trenton sobbed hysterically into the hardwood floor. He twisted his body frantically, trying to break free from the operative's heavy boot, but he was completely immobilized. "Jocelyn, please," he cried, his previous rage dissolving into pathetic, whining panic. "Tell them to let me go. I am sorry. I just lost my mind. I do not want to go to jail. Please have mercy on me." Before I could answer his pathetic begging, the heavy wail of police sirens echoed loudly from the city streets far below the penthouse windows. The elevators chimed simultaneously in the lobby. A dozen uniformed Chicago police officers poured into the wrecked entryway, their hands resting on their weapons. The building concierge had triggered the silent emergency alarm the second Trenton smashed through the downstairs security gate. The lead detective stepped into the living room and surveyed the scene. He looked at Trenton pinned to the floor, then looked up at me. "We received a distress call from the building management," the detective announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We also have active federal warrants for this man regarding severe corporate embezzlement, massive tax fraud, and bribery of public officials." My security team stepped back, allowing the police officers to haul Trenton roughly to his feet. The detective ripped off the zip ties and violently clamped the heavy steel handcuffs around Trenton's wrists, locking them tightly. Trenton wept uncontrollably, his knees buckling as the officers held him upright. He looked completely and utterly broken. "Take him away," I instructed the detective coldly. "I am pressing charges for breaking and entering, property damage, and aggravated assault." The police officers dragged Trenton forcefully toward the ruined double doors. He looked back over his shoulder, his tear-streaked face twisted in sheer terror as they pulled him out of my luxurious sanctuary and into the cold, harsh reality of his permanent destruction. 2 weeks passed since the heavy steel doors of the county jail slammed shut behind my husband. The federal government moved with breathtaking speed to liquidate the seized Sinclair assets. The massive debts Richard and Trenton accumulated required immediate repayment. The crown jewel of their fraudulent empire was scheduled for public auction on a freezing Tuesday morning. The Sinclair family estate was a sprawling historic mansion situated in the most exclusive, gated neighborhood in the Chicago suburbs. For 5 agonizing years, I was forced to attend miserable Sunday dinners inside those towering brick walls. I was subjected to endless suffocating lectures about the superior breeding of old money. I was mocked for my posture, my clothing, and my work ethic. Today, that sacred fortress of generational arrogance was reduced to a simple distressed commodity. I arrived at the estate in the back of my father's armored Maybach. The sprawling front lawn was completely unrecognizable. The pristine grass was trampled by a hungry crowd of aggressive real estate developers, bank liquidators, and curious neighbors, eager to witness a spectacular high society downfall. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a tailored black trench coat and dark sunglasses. I walked through the crowd. The aggressive investors parted for me immediately, recognizing the lethal Kensington security detail flanking my sides. I stopped at the very front of the auction stage. Up on the grand marble porch, huddled together like frightened animals, stood Felicity and her mother Helen. They wore heavy designer coats, clutching each other as tears streamed down their pale faces. They were desperately hoping one of their wealthy country club friends would purchase the estate and mercifully allow them to remain inside. They still genuinely believed their social status would save them. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium and banged his wooden gavel. He announced the starting bid at a severely discounted rate, a humiliating fraction of what the historic property was actually worth. A local developer quickly raised his paddle. Another investor countered. The bidding war was slow, insulting, and entirely pathetic. I did not wait for the price to incrementally climb. I raised my hand. I offered a singular flat cash bid that doubled the current asking price. My voice cut through the freezing morning air with absolute, unquestionable authority. The entire crowd of seasoned investors immediately lowered their paddles. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew fighting Kensington Holdings was professional suicide. The auctioneer banged his gavel 3 times. "Sold," he announced loudly. I walked straight up the grand marble steps of the estate. Felicity and Helen backed away from me, their eyes wide with sheer unadulterated panic. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a certified cashier's check, and handed it directly to the bank liquidator standing near the front door. The transaction was instantly finalized. I legally owned the very ground they were standing on. I turned to face my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law. Helen choked on a loud sob, burying her face in her hands. Felicity stared at me, her entire body shaking violently in the bitter cold. "Jocelyn, please." Helen begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "This is our ancestral home. My grandfather built these walls. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." Isaiah took all of Felicity's money and disappeared. Richard is still in the hospital facing federal indictment. Trenton is sitting in a jail cell. "You have punished us enough. Please let us stay in the guest house. We will stay out of your way." I looked at the 2 women who had spent half a decade making me feel utterly worthless. I remembered Helen sneering at my choice of career, calling me a common laborer. I remembered Felicity intentionally spilling red wine on my only expensive dress at a holiday party and laughing about it. "Your ancestral home was built on a foundation of tax fraud and stolen investor capital," I replied, my voice echoing sharply across the empty porch. "Your old money pride was nothing but a fragile, pathetic illusion funded by criminal activity. You did not earn a single brick of this estate. You just inherited the ability to look down on people who actually work for a living. I am not punishing you, Helen. I am simply removing the stolen luxury you used to justify your cruel, toxic behavior." Felicity stepped forward, her face flushed with desperate anger. "You cannot just throw us out into the street," Felicity screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "We are high society. We belong here. You are just a vindictive, hateful monster." I took one step closer to Felicity, forcing her to shrink back against the heavy wooden front door. "You are currently trespassing on my private commercial property," I stated coldly. "I am giving you exactly 10 minutes to go upstairs, pack exactly 2 suitcases each, and vacate my premises. If you are not walking down that driveway when the timer expires, my security team will physically drag you out by your hair and leave you shivering on the curb with absolutely nothing." Felicity opened her mouth to argue, but the terrifying, unblinking stares of my security operatives silenced her completely. Helen grabbed her daughter's arm and dragged her inside the house, sobbing hysterically. I stood on the porch and checked my watch. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Exactly 10 minutes later, the heavy front door slowly opened. Felicity and Helen stepped out into the freezing wind. They each dragged 2 oversized designer suitcases across the marble porch. They had lost their jewelry, their artwork, and their entire identity. They stumbled down the grand steps, weeping loudly, as the gathered crowd of former neighbors watched their spectacular disgrace in absolute silence. They began the long, humiliating walk down the sprawling concrete driveway toward the main gates. I watched their retreating figures for a moment. Then I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single predetermined signal. I looked across the street past the iron gates of the estate. A heavy line of massive yellow demolition bulldozers sat idling in the vacant lot opposite the property. The moment I sent the signal, the heavy diesel engines roared to life, revving with a deafening, violent thunder that shook the frozen ground. The deafening roar of the massive yellow bulldozers tearing into the brick foundation of the Sinclair estate was a highly satisfying symphony. I watched the historic mansion crumble into a mountain of worthless dust and debris. Felicity and Helen were permanently erased from my life. But the total destruction of the Sinclair family was still missing one crucial piece. A very slippery and highly intelligent rat had managed to scramble off the sinking ship before it went completely under the water. Isaiah was an incredibly brilliant corporate lawyer. He had spent his entire life fighting his way out of the south side of Chicago to sit at the most exclusive tables in the city. He possessed a razor-sharp survival instinct. When he realized that Kensington Holdings was orchestrating the absolute ruin of his arrogant in-laws, he did not hesitate to save himself. He drained every single joint bank account he shared with Felicity, abandoned her to face my wrath alone, and boarded a private flight out of the country before the federal agents even breached the hotel ballroom. He fled to a remote, sun-drenched island nation with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. He purchased a secluded luxury villa overlooking the ocean, believing his legal expertise and stolen wealth made him completely untouchable. He severely underestimated the boundless, terrifying reach of my father. William Kensington did not rely on international treaties or slow-moving government bureaucracy. My father employed private security contractors who operated entirely outside the confines of traditional law. They were ghosts who specialized in tracking down corporate fugitives. Isaiah was sitting on the private terrace of his island villa, enjoying a glass of expensive bourbon and watching the sunset. He felt incredibly smug. He had successfully betrayed Richard, escaped the federal raid, and secured his financial future. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted a Wall Street leviathan. He raised his glass to toast his own sheer brilliance. He never even saw the tactical shadows move behind him. 3 of my father's elite operatives breached the secure perimeter of his villa without making a single sound. They did not announce their presence or read him his rights. The lead operative simply clamped a heavy hand over Isaiah's mouth, dragging him backward out of his lounge chair. The expensive bourbon shattered against the stone patio. They bound his wrists with industrial zip ties, placed a dark hood over his head, and hauled him into the back of an unmarked vehicle. Isaiah's stolen luxury evaporated in a matter of seconds. He was bundled onto a private jet and flown directly back into the freezing jurisdiction of the United States. When the dark hood was finally pulled from his head, Isaiah found himself sitting in a cold, windowless interrogation room located inside a private hangar at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The blinding fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead. He blinked rapidly, his heart hammering against his ribs in absolute terror. I sat directly across the metal table from him. I wore a tailored black suit, my posture radiating complete lethal control. My father stood silently in the corner of the room, leaning heavily on his silver-handled walking cane. Isaiah stared at us, his dark skin turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He tugged frantically at the zip ties binding his wrists to the metal chair. "You cannot do this to me," Isaiah stammered, his voice cracking with intense panic. "I gave you the flash drive. I gave you all the evidence you needed to destroy Richard and Trenton. We made a deal in that jazz lounge. I held up my end of the bargain. I am a cooperating witness. You cannot kidnap me from a sovereign nation." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cold metal table. I looked at the broken, terrified man who had confidently marched into my office just weeks ago to steal my business. "We did make a deal regarding your cooperation against Richard," I replied smoothly. "And I kept my word. I did not hand the federal prosecutors the evidence of your complicity in his tax evasion schemes. I let you walk away from the Sinclair family crimes completely unscathed. But you forgot one incredibly important detail, Isaiah." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the fraudulent court injunction he had slammed onto my glass desk the morning after the anniversary gala. I slid the forged legal document across the metal table until it rested right in front of his shaking hands. "You illegally seized a public relations firm that legally belonged to the sole heir of the Kensington Empire," I stated coldly. "You drafted a fraudulent court order to steal my personal property because you wanted to impress a family of arrogant fools. You committed severe federal perjury when you filed this document with a corrupt judge. That was a direct attack on me, and I never grant immunity for personal attacks." Isaiah began to hyperventilate. His brilliant legal mind quickly calculated the catastrophic trap closing around him. He realized his entire career was completely over. My father's security operative stepped forward, hauling Isaiah forcefully to his feet. "The federal authorities are waiting outside this hangar right now," I announced, standing up from my chair. "They are eager to arrest a high-profile corporate lawyer for federal perjury and fraud. By tomorrow morning, the State Bar Association will permanently revoke your legal license. You will never practice law again. You will lose your status, your wealth, and your freedom. You traded your integrity for a seat at the Sinclair table, and now you will share their spectacular downfall." Isaiah sobbed loudly as the operatives dragged him out the heavy steel doors. He became exactly what he feared most. He was powerless, caged, and stripped of his identity. I watched him disappear into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. The final traitor was eliminated. I returned to my executive office in the city, feeling the massive weight of the past 5 years completely lift from my shoulders. The empire I built was safe. My enemies were utterly decimated. I sat behind my glass desk and opened my laptop to review my upcoming crisis management campaigns. My private assistant knocked softly on the glass door. She stepped into the room holding a formal manila envelope. She looked slightly hesitant as she placed it on my desk. "This was just delivered by a courier," she explained quietly. "It is highly urgent." I picked up the envelope and sliced it open. It was an official visitor request form generated from the maximum security federal penitentiary holding facility. The name at the top of the form made my blood run instantly cold. Trenton was begging me to come see him one last time before his formal sentencing hearing. I stared at the official visitor request form resting on my pristine glass desk. Trenton was scheduled for his formal federal sentencing hearing by the end of the week. He faced 2 decades in a maximum security facility for massive corporate embezzlement and bribery. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. His arrogant real estate empire was gone. His mansions were demolished. His entire family was completely destitute and permanently erased from Chicago high society. Yet, in his final moments of freedom, he used his one allowed request to beg for my presence. I decided to grant his pathetic wish. I did not go to offer him closure. I went to deliver the absolute finality of his destruction in person. The maximum security federal penitentiary was a bleak fortress of gray concrete. It stood in stark contrast to the glittering ballrooms Trenton had once strutted through. I arrived at the prison gates in the back of my father's heavily armored Maybach. I wore a perfectly tailored ivory suit projecting total authority. I walked through the metal detectors with my posture impeccably straight. The heavy steel doors clanged shut behind me, sealing out the free world. I was escorted down a long, sterile corridor smelling of strong bleach and sheer despair. The visitation room was divided by a thick wall of bulletproof glass. I sat down in the rigid metal chair and waited. A heavy door opened on the opposite side of the glass. 2 large correctional officers escorted Trenton into the small booth. I barely recognized the man shuffling toward the glass partition. The arrogant, untouchable vice president of Sinclair Real Estate was completely gone. Trenton wore an oversized bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his depleted frame. His expensive designer haircut had been shaved down to the scalp. His face was gaunt, deeply lined with profound exhaustion and raw terror. He looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. He sat down heavily in the metal chair and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver with violently shaking hands. I picked up the receiver on my side. I simply stared at him through the thick, smudged glass. "Jocelyn," Trenton whispered. His voice was a raspy, broken croak. "Thank you for coming. I did not think you would actually show up. I have been sitting in that concrete cell for weeks, playing everything over and over in my head." I let the oppressive weight of the prison walls press down on him. "I lost absolutely everything," Trenton sobbed. His bloodshot eyes welled with pathetic tears that spilled down his sunken cheeks. "My father is going to die in a prison hospital. Felicity is living in a homeless shelter because Isaiah stole every single penny she had. The state seized my bank accounts. The judge is going to give me 20 years minimum tomorrow morning. I am going to rot in this cage, Jocelyn." "You built the cage yourself, Trenton," I replied coldly. "I just locked the door." Trenton pressed his trembling free hand against the bulletproof glass. "Why did you not just tell me?" Trenton pleaded, his voice cracking with hysterical desperation. Why did you hide who you really were for 5 entire years? If you had told me you were heir to a multi-billion-dollar Wall Street empire, none of this would have ever happened. I would have given you anything you wanted. I would have treated you like a queen. My family would have worshipped you. Why did you let me believe you were just a struggling girl from nowhere? I looked at his pathetic, tear-stained face. He still completely missed the point. His narcissism was so deeply ingrained, he genuinely believed my wealth would have been the only valid reason to treat me with basic human decency. He only valued power, and because he thought I had none, he felt entirely justified in crushing me. I leaned forward, bringing my face inches from the thick glass. I made sure he could see the absolute lethal certainty in my eyes. Because I wanted to see exactly what kind of monster you were when you thought I had no power, I stated quietly. The truth hit him like a physical blow. When you thought I was a poor charity case relying on your wealth, you showed me your true soul, I continued, my voice echoing. You used my crisis management firm to cover up your felony crimes without a single ounce of gratitude. You embezzled from your own investors to buy diamonds for your mistress. You mocked my background. You allowed your arrogant father and your spoiled sister to treat me like garbage. And on our anniversary, when I spoke the truth, you slapped me across the face in front of 1,000 laughing people. Trenton sobbed violently, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his monstrous behavior was laid bare. You thought true power required shouting and physical violence, I explained, watching him. You thought slapping a woman proved your dominance. But true power, whispers Trenton. True power is owning the bank that holds your corporate debt and smiling at you across the breakfast table. I hid my empire because I needed to know if the man I married had a shred of actual integrity. You failed the test spectacularly. You signed your own death warrant the second your hand struck my face. Please, Jocelyn, Trenton wailed, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Have mercy on me, I am begging you. Talk to the judge, tell them I am sorry. I stood up from the metal chair. I looked down at the broken, weeping shell of a man who once believed he owned the entire city of Chicago. You wanted me to starve in the streets, Trenton, I reminded him flawlessly. Enjoy your concrete cage. I placed the black receiver gently back onto the metal hook. I walked away. I stepped into the bright sunlight. The greatest lesson we can learn from this journey is that true power never needs to shout. When toxic relatives try to tear you down and underestimate your worth, the most devastating revenge is building your own unshakable independence. You do not have to accept the role of the victim just because you share their bloodline. Real strength means walking away from conditional love to create an empire entirely your own. Your relentless success will always be your greatest defense. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family? Share your story below, then like and subscribe today